When we last left the front suspension, we had the control arms and uprights all welded up, and we had painted them to hide the fact that my welding got lazier as I went along. It turns out my welding quality is a function of how much I care about my welding quality. But before we can get the suspension installed, we have to add the mounts for the suspension to the Viper. I'm not using the old stock Viper mounts, I'm making new mounts. Stronger mounts. Better mounts. Mounts added with too little concern about welding quality. The first step in this process was to remove the wheel liners. They're all held in with these rivets, so I had to drill them all out. Apparently this was never deemed a serviceable item. Then I had to remove the bolts that held on the upper control arms. Apparently this plate was welded on with these bolts already in place, so if you strip or break these bolts, you're kind of screwed. Anyway, I cut them off and removed the nubs from the back. This is the actual point of no return with the Viper. It's not going back to normal after this. I will make this thing an off-road Viper, or I will have just ruined a $40,000 car. I had designed some mounts for the upper control arms before I bothered to take out the wheel liners. Unfortunately, the structure behind the wheel liner was more complicated than I had previously thought, so I threw all those designs in the trash, rescanned the car, and started over. Locating the upper mounts was going to be a bit of a challenge, so I had to laser cut out some patterns that would line up with the existing parts of the frame and help me get the mounts in the right places. The right place for the front upper mount is actually behind this metal plate here. I could have put the mounts outside of this plate, but the longer upper control arm gives me a lot better geometry, especially at full compression. Unfortunately, this put the tabs in places that were hard to get good welds. I do think this is all structurally good, but it looks pretty bad, so don't tell anyone. I don't want to remove the air conditioning lines, but I did end up draining the coolant and removing the hoses to get back in and fix up some of these ugly welds. I got the front upper mounts welded up, and then I installed the control arm to get the rears in the right place relative to the fronts. I finished welding without the control arm in, so I hope nothing walked around too much. I also had to remove the brake proportioning valve. It was right where my left upper rear mount wanted to be. Since I'm using completely different brakes in the rear, I got a new adjustable proportioning valve. The early Vipers are notorious for having crappy brakes. These are the rears, and these are the new rears that I'm putting on. The early Viper brakes were so bad that a modern Jeep Wrangler has rear brakes with more pad area and a bigger rotor than the Viper's front brakes. So I will definitely need to dial down the rear brake power. You really don't want the rear brakes to lock up before the fronts, otherwise the car becomes unstable and you will spin out and slide backwards on fire into a PF Chang's. I made a new bracket to adapt the new proportioning valve to the old mount. I managed to get the old lines from the master cylinder to work and the line going to the right front, but I had to make a new line for the left front. Both of these got new adapters to 3AN flexible lines that I will add later. The line going to the rear was also reused, mostly. It already had a flare and a fitting, but the fitting was half 20 thread on a 3/16 line, and I found out that literally no one in the world makes a union for half 20 threads on a 3/16 line. It's all for 5/16 lines. So I reflared it and ran a short jumper line to the new master cylinder. Brake lines are mostly done. I did also have this random tube coming from the rear of the car going to the front fascia area. It was in the way, so I cut it short. I don't know what it does, but I should probably figure that out eventually. Getting the lower control arm mounts on the car meant really getting into my least favorite part of car projects, grinding off paint and metal. So much grinding. The mounts are just these big tabs coming off of the frame, but I added these rectangular crossbars connecting each side. I also added a reinforcement plate to the frame. The Viper frame is pretty thin, and I don't want a hard rock hit or bounce to just rip the tabs out of the frame. I cut the rectangular bars to length, capped them off, and welded on the tabs. This welding warped the tabs a bit, so I used some all-thread to get them back into the right spacing. I added a removable bar to the rear mount so I can get to the oil pan. I also had to make that mount shorter to clear the pan since I'll be lowering the transmission mount and thus lowering the rear of the oil pan. This removable bar is held in with these laser cut tabs. I tacked them in place, fully welded them to the removable center bars, drilled out the holes, and then cut the tack welds. After I made these, I decided I didn't like the flimsy tabs, so I added extra tabs to my tabs. Then I painted it. Looks great. I welded in the mounts for the lower control arms after the uppers because I have some adjustability in the lowers. The uppers are kind of where they are based on the frame complexity, but the lowers can slide forward or back a bit. This means I can set up the caster correctly the first time, which is good since I didn't add any adjustment for that. I assembled the lower arms onto the mounting tubes I'd made, attached the uprights, and then I just installed and lifted the whole assembly under the car. This was more difficult than it looks, and yes, I know it looks pretty difficult. I probably didn't need the uprights on at this point. With everything in place, I bolted it all together, and I had front suspension, kind of. It felt like a real project at this point. Before I welded in the mounts, I had to get the geometry correct. I got out the hammer and tapped the lower mounts forward or back until the side of this upright was vertical. Or close enough. This being vertical means my caster is set at about 4 degrees, which is a pretty good caster angle, I think. Probably. I hope so. With everything in place, I welded the lower mounts to the frame. You can see here this tab lands right between these two welded plates, right on the frame rail. It's almost like I designed it that way. I didn't, but it's almost like I did. I made new steering tie rods so I could use spherical rod ends. I bought weld tube nuts for the rod end side, but for the steering rack side I just made my own, or I tried to until the crappy tap I bought broke on the first try. I was about to send it back for a replacement, but I decided to see if I could grind it down and make a stubby tab work since I'd already had the tap started. It worked fine. Still gotta stop buying tools on Amazon. I got these high misalignment spacers for the steering, then I realized they didn't fit, so I modified them on the lathe, then I realized they were too tall. So I got these misalignment spacers, which were also too tall and needed to be modified. Then they didn't work because the landing was too big, so I just did what I should have done in the first place and made my own. You want something done right? Do it yourself. Or measure correctly the first time. I had originally planned on using the existing coilover mounts, but there were a couple of problems with that. One was that they're kind of flimsy looking. I could beef them up with some extra reinforcement, but I also had other issues. My shock lengths were about an inch shorter than I had originally thought I needed. If I could move the shock mount up about an inch, that would allow me to use a better, longer dual spring coilover. Unfortunately, it's a little harder than just drilling a new hole higher. The mount was already too wide, so I could add some reinforcements with new holes inside the existing mount, but this puts the top of the coilover inside these side reinforcement flanges. So I had to stack another spacer on the outside and then weld in a new bent metal flange. Then I could just cut out the old one. This worked, mostly. It's pretty rough looking, but again, I think it's structurally fine. The left side did clean up a bit better. I also had to carefully smash the top flanges out to get the top of the coilover to fit in. As soon as I slather this thing in semi-gloss black paint, nobody will know the horrors that lie underneath. On the uprights, I added a set screw to retain the upper bolts. The bolt just slides in through a sleeve I welded in. I put a hex pattern in to keep these things from turning when I'm tightening the nut on top, but there wasn't anything keeping them from sliding out. I don't want to weld them in, I do want them to be serviceable in case the threads get messed up, and yes, this means I am less lazy than Dodge engineers, which is impressive, because I'm pretty lazy. Anyway, this was just a matter of drilling and tapping some holes into those sleeves. I bought the correct length set screws so it would be mostly flush with the outside and doused it in Loctite so it wouldn't come undone. I considered powder coating the suspension parts on this car, but I'm probably going to be making some changes, and also I was too impatient to wait for powder coating, so I just spray painted everything. There will be touch-ups in the future, I'm sure. These uprights are open on the inside, so I had to come up with a way to get the paint inside there. I opted to tape off the openings and just swish Pour 15 around the inside to coat everything. I did the same thing on my Jag uprights. It's messy, but it gets the job done. The control arms were mostly complete, but needed a few more things. The lowers needed sleeves welded in. I wanted to close off the inside since I don't have any paint or corrosion control inside. I just cut some tubes to length with the correct angle, shoved them in, and welded them up. Then I gave it a nice coat of paint along with some underbody protection to help keep the rock chips off. I also had to redo the grease fittings on these. I put them kind of in the bottom on the back, but then my lower control arm mounts caused them to break off when the control arm moved down all the way. I didn't notice this because I got lazy with the CAD and didn't add these in, so I bought new 90-degree ones, drilled and tapped the control arms, and added them to the top. Then I just plugged off the old ones. The upper control arms had issues with the rod ends being not so secure. The normal way of fixing this is to use jam nuts. I tried that, but the jam nuts were too big. They pushed the control arm out too much, so I found some thinner ones and tried that. Unfortunately, the nuts limit the movement of the upper control arm. This is not enough for suspension travel that I want. It works fine without the nut, but unfortunately the threads are too loose. I probably would have noticed this nut interference had I spent the time to add these into CAD model, but as we already established, I'm pretty lazy. I do need a way to keep the rod ends from flapping around. I thought about tapping the control arms and just holding the rod ends in place with a couple of set screws. I'd probably have to put little flat landings on the threads. I'm not a huge fan of that. But then I thought, why don't I just use the clamps? The clamps! I cut a slot in the control arm, drilled out a couple of pieces of steel, and welded them on. So I can just tighten down these bolts, clamp it down, and secure the threads. I might also add O-rings between the rod ends and the mounts just to be extra sure they don't walk around. So that's it, everything is done. It's all welded on. I test fit everything. Time to assemble. But first, paint. I painted the control arms and uprights already, but not the stuff I added to the frame. For this, I used 2-part epoxy paint. I like this stuff because it has warnings all over the can. The more warnings your cans have, the better the chemicals or paint are, I think. Just make sure to use the proper safety equipment. I kind of half-assed the masking on this, so there is overspray. There's also underspray. It was hard to get all up in here, so I'll have to go back with a brush and some chassis paint to get the parts I didn't get. I have a feeling I'm going to drive this car through a puddle and then a dozen rust spots are going to show up. Thankfully, they make paint that goes over rust. That's how I'm going to make sure everything gets painted, because I like to do things right the third time. One other thing, the wheel liners, they need to go back in. I kind of need these to keep rocks from flying into my engine bay, and also because stuff mounts to them, like the coolant reservoir and a windshield washer fluid reservoir. They needed some slight modifications to make them work with the new suspension mounts. I kind of just eyeballed it and then cut out the parts that needed cut. Then I traced that cut to the driver's side. These are made out of fiberglass, which I thought was a little surprising. I figured they'd be some cheaper plastic. They were not kind to my jigsaw blades. With that done, everything went back together, except for that I forgot I needed to tap the uprights for the brake caliper mount, and I broke a drill bit doing that. And I also needed to drill out the holes for the hub bolts slightly larger. There were a lot of little things to do, and there's going to be a lot of little things left to do. But all the big stuff is done, except the front shocks. But that's what we'll be talking about next time. See you then. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.